My twin sister sat across from me at our mother's kitchen table and told me, quite calmly, that she and Foster were in love and that she hoped I could find a way to be happy for them. I remember looking at her hands while she said it. The engagement ring I'd worn for 8 months was gone from my own finger by then, sitting in a drawer at my apartment because I couldn't stand the weight of it anymore. And there, on my sister's hand, 3 weeks later, was a new ring. Smaller. Different setting. But the same man had bought it. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I sat very still and said, "I hope you'll both be very happy," in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it sounded. What I did not tell her that day, because I did not know it myself yet, was that 11 months later she would walk into a job interview, hand over my name as a professional reference without asking me first, and apply for a position at a company where I happened to sit on the executive committee that approved every senior hire. She had no idea whose signature would eventually decide whether she kept that job. My name is Odessa Whitfield. My twin sister's name is Marisette. We are 34 years old, born 9 minutes apart, and for most of our lives, people treated that closeness like something sacred, something unbreakable. I used to believe that too. This is the story of the year I learned exactly how breakable it actually was, and what I built out of the pieces afterward. Marisette and I grew up close in the way twins are supposed to be close, sharing a room until we were 14, finishing each other's sentences at family dinners, the two Whitfield girls, always mentioned together, like a single unit with two faces. But if you looked closely, and for a long time I didn't let myself look closely, you would have noticed something underneath that closeness that was never quite even. Marisette had always been the more effortlessly charming one, the one teachers remembered fondly, the one who could walk into a room and have people leaning toward her within minutes. I was the steadier one, the reliable one, the one people trusted with responsibility rather than delight. Our mother used to say it without meaning any harm by it, "Odessa gets things done, and Marisette makes everyone feel good while she does it." I used to think that was a compliment to both of us. Looking back, I think it quietly trained both of us, from a very young age, to believe that Marisette's role was to be loved, and mine was to be useful. I built a career in corporate finance, starting as a junior analyst at a regional bank straight out of graduate school and working my way, over 12 careful years, into a director-level role at Holloway Meridian Group, a mid-sized investment and advisory firm with offices in 4 cities. I was good at my job. Not flashy, not the kind of person who gets profiled in industry magazines, but genuinely good, the kind of quietly excellent that gets you invited onto executive committees eventually. Which is exactly what happened to me 2 years before any of this story really begins. I was one of 6 people who sat on Holloway Meridian Senior Hiring Committee, the group that reviewed and approved every hire above a certain compensation threshold across the firm. Marisette's career had taken a more winding path. She'd tried marketing, then event planning, then a stretch running social media for a boutique fitness studio that closed during a rough economic year. She was talented in scattered ways, but she had never quite found the steady footing I had, and I don't say that to be unkind. It's simply true, and it matters later. I met Foster Callahan 4 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party. He was an architect, thoughtful and a little quiet in the way that made you lean in to hear him rather than the other way around, and we fell into something that felt, for the first 2 years, genuinely solid. He proposed on a weekend trip to the coast, on a beach at sunset, in the kind of moment that felt almost embarrassingly perfect, and I said yes without a single doubt in my body. Marisette was at every family gathering during our engagement, of course, because that's what sisters are for, and Foster liked her the way most people liked her, easily and without much thought. I never once suspected anything, not because I was naive, but because there was genuinely nothing to suspect for a long time. I believe that. I still believe that. What changed, as far as I've ever been able to piece together, started about 8 months before the wedding. During a stretch when I was working brutal hours on a merger deal that had me leaving the apartment before 6 and coming home after 10 most nights for nearly 2 months straight. Foster and Marisette started spending more time together during that stretch, initially in ways that made complete sense. She'd stop by to keep him company for dinner since I couldn't be there. She'd help him pick out furniture for the apartment we were supposed to move into together after the wedding. Small, reasonable things that I was, if anything, grateful for at the time, because I felt guilty about how absent I'd become. I found out the truth on a Tuesday evening in March, 3 months before our wedding date, when I came home 4 hours earlier than expected because the deal I'd been working on had finally closed. I walked into my own apartment and found Foster and Marisette on the couch, not doing anything dramatic, just sitting close together with a bottle of wine between them, but there was something in the way they both went completely silent when I walked in. Something in the particular way Marisette's hand moved away from Foster's arm a half-second too late that told me everything before either of them said a single word. I want to skip over the actual conversation that followed because some things are too raw to hand to strangers even years later. What I'll say is that it had been going on, by Foster's own eventual admission, for about 5 weeks. He said it just happened. He said he never meant to hurt me. Marisette, when I finally called her later that night, cried and said almost the same words, as if the two of them had rehearsed the same script separately without meaning to. I broke off the engagement within the week. I moved out of the apartment we'd shared and into a small one-bedroom across town within the month. And exactly 11 weeks after I found them on that couch, Foster and Marisette announced their own engagement at a family dinner I was, mercifully, not invited to, though my mother told me about it over the phone the next morning in a tone that somehow managed to sound both apologetic and faintly hopeful that I might find a way to attend the eventual wedding. I did not attend the eventual wedding. That happened 7 months later, a small ceremony at a vineyard, and I sent a card and nothing else. My mother, to her credit, did not push me on it, though I know it cost our extended family a great deal of quiet, careful conversation about how to seat people at holidays going forward. I spent that year rebuilding, the way you do, slowly and without much grace. I threw myself into work, partly because it was the one part of my life that had never betrayed me, and partly because Holloway Meridian was, at that exact time, going through a significant expansion, absorbing a smaller advisory firm and restructuring several departments to integrate the two companies. It kept me busy in a way that felt almost merciful. I did not speak to Marisette during that entire year, beyond the barest necessary contact at our mother's Thanksgiving table, where we sat at opposite ends and spoke perhaps 11 words to each other the entire evening. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I did not spend that year plotting revenge. I want to be very clear about that. I spent that year simply trying to survive an ordinary, devastating betrayal, the kind that happens to people every single day, the kind that doesn't come with any built-in mechanism for justice. I assumed, honestly, that Marisette and Foster would simply go on living their lives, and that I would go on living mine at a careful distance, and that would be the entire shape of the story. A quiet, permanent estrangement. No confrontation. No reckoning. Just absence. That assumption held for almost exactly 11 months, until the Tuesday morning I walked into the hiring committee's weekly review meeting and found my sister's resume sitting in the stack of candidates for a newly created position. Senior Client Relations Manager in the Wealth Advisory Division Holloway Meridian had absorbed during the merger. I recognized her name before I even fully processed what I was looking at. Marisette Whitfield Callahan, since she'd taken Foster's name, which was part of why it took me a full beat longer than it should have to register exactly who this was. I sat in that conference room, coffee going cold in front of me, staring at a resume that listed her recent role running marketing for a boutique consulting firm, a role I hadn't even known she'd taken, since we hadn't spoken in nearly a year. And there, in the references section, third name down, was mine. Odessa Whitfield, Director, Holloway Meridian Group. Listed as a professional reference, with my old direct phone extension, the one from before my promotion 2 years earlier, which told me she must have pulled it from some old contact she'd saved long before any of this happened, never updating it, never once considering that she might need to actually ask me first. She had not asked me. She had not warned me. She had, apparently, applied for a position at my own company, using my name to vouch for her professional character, without a single thought that I might be sitting in the very room where that application would be reviewed. I sat through the rest of that meeting saying almost nothing, my mind working through something I hadn't fully expected to feel, which was not, at first, anger. It was something closer to disbelief, the particular kind of disbelief that comes from realizing that someone who hurt you that deeply had, in the time since, apparently thought about you so little that she never imagined the possibility of consequences. I did not say anything in that meeting about my connection to the candidate. I want to explain why, because it matters for everything that followed. Holloway Meridian had strict conflict of interest policies, the kind every serious firm has, requiring committee members to disclose any personal relationship with a candidate before participating in that candidate's review. I knew this policy well. I had helped write parts of it 2 years earlier during a broader compliance overhaul. I went to my supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Perpetua Nakashima who ran the entire Wealth Advisory Division, immediately after the meeting ended, and I disclosed everything. Marisette was my twin sister. We were estranged, for reasons I did not go into detail about, but I made clear the estrangement was serious and personal. I told Perpetua I needed to recuse myself entirely from any review or decision involving her application, and that I wanted that recusal formally documented. Perpetua listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, and then said something I have thought about often since. I appreciate you bringing this to me directly, Odessa. Most people in your position would have either quietly torpedoed the application or quietly let it slide through without saying anything at all. You did neither. That matters. She formally recused me from the hiring decision, documented it in the file, and assigned another committee member to handle the review in my place. I want to be honest, I did not do this purely out of principle. Part of me did it because I genuinely did not trust myself to be fair in either direction, and I did not want any outcome, good or bad for Marisette, to be something she or anyone else could later claim was tainted by our history. But part of me, I'll admit, also understood something practical in that moment. By stepping back cleanly and correctly, I remained completely blameless in whatever happened next, while Marisette remained entirely unaware that I even worked there. Let alone that I'd been the one who set the process in motion by disclosing our relationship at all. Because here is the thing Marisette did not know and would not learn for several more weeks. Her application moved forward. She interviewed well, apparently, with the committee member who replaced me, a careful, fair man named Reginald Achterberg who had no personal stake in the outcome whatsoever and evaluated her purely on merit. Her professional background, it turned out, was genuinely solid. Whatever else was true about my sister, she had real talent for client relationships, the kind of warmth that made people trust her quickly, and the committee, evaluating her fairly and without any interference from me, ultimately approved her for the position. She was hired. She started 6 weeks later in the Wealth Advisory Division, on the 14th floor. My office was on the 16th floor. Different division, different reporting structure, different day-to-day world entirely, in a company of over 1,100 employees. It was entirely plausible, even likely, that she could work there for months without our paths crossing at all, especially since neither of us had any reason to seek the other out. I did not tell her I worked there. I want to sit with that decision for a moment, because I've asked myself many times since whether it was fair, whether I owed her some kind of warning. I've come to believe the answer is no, and here is why. I had not hidden anything from the company. I had disclosed our relationship fully and immediately, the moment I became aware of a conflict, exactly as policy required. I had recused myself completely from her hiring. I had done nothing improper, nothing dishonest, nothing that violated a single rule or a single ethical line. The only thing I had not done was reach out to my estranged sister, who had stolen my fiancé and used my name without permission, to give her a courtesy warning about her own job application. I decided, and I still believe this was the right decision, that I did not owe her that courtesy. She had not extended me any courtesy at all when she sat on my couch with my fiancé 5 weeks before my wedding. For the first 4 months of her employment, our paths genuinely did not cross. I heard her name occasionally, secondhand, the way you hear about any colleague in a large building. Someone mentioned once that the new client relations manager in wealth advisory was doing well, building strong relationships with several key accounts. I felt an odd, complicated pang hearing that, some tangled mixture of resentment and, buried under it somewhere I didn't want to look too closely at, an old habit of being glad when my sister succeeded at something. A habit built over 34 years that apparently didn't switch off just because it should have. The collision, when it finally came, happened because of the same merger integration that had brought Marisette into the company in the first place. 6 months after her hire, Holloway Meridian finalized the second phase of the restructuring, folding the absorbed firm's remaining client accounts fully into the parent company's systems and compliance structure. This meant every employee who had come over through the merger, or been hired into a merger-related role afterward, needed their employment file formally reviewed and reauthorized under the parent company's full compliance standards, a process that included a fresh background verification and reference confirmation. I did not run this process personally. It was handled by human resources, working alongside compliance. But because I sat on the executive committee overseeing the wealth advisory division's integration, the final approval list for every reauthorized employee crossed my desk for sign-off, a formality, usually. A batch of 40 or 50 names I'd review and approve in a single afternoon. Marisette's name was on that list. And beside it, flagged in yellow by the compliance team, was a note indicating that her original reference verification, from 11 months earlier, had never actually been completed. The reference she'd listed me had been recused from her hiring process before the standard reference check was ever conducted, and in the confusion of that recusal, the check had simply fallen through the cracks entirely. Nobody had ever actually called to verify my professional endorsement of her, because the file had been quietly flagged as reference conflict, do not contact, and then, apparently, forgotten in the shuffle of a busy hiring season. Compliance now needed it resolved before her reauthorization could proceed. And, because I was the listed reference, and because my prior recusal was already documented in her file, the compliance officer handling the review, a careful young man named Casimiro Duya, sent the request directly to me, along with a note explaining the situation and asking whether I was now willing and able to provide the standard written reference confirmation, given that enough time had passed since my original recusal. I sat with that email for a long time before responding. I want to walk through exactly what I was looking at because I think it matters. I was not being asked to fire my sister. I was not being asked to sabotage her. I was being asked a simple, factual question. Could I, in good conscience, as a professional reference, confirm or deny her competence and character in a work context? If I declined to provide it, or if I provided a negative reference, her reauthorization would be delayed, possibly indefinitely, while compliance sought an alternative path forward, which could easily put her position at genuine risk during a company-wide restructuring where they were actively looking for reasons to streamline headcount. If I provided an honest, positive reference, based purely on what I actually knew of her professional character before any of this happened between us, her reauthorization would proceed normally. And she would likely never even know the request had gone through me at all, since compliance references were handled confidentially by policy. I thought about Foster. I thought about that couch, that bottle of wine, the 8 months I'd spent planning a wedding that never happened. I thought about 11 months of silence, about a resume with my old phone number on it, listed without a single word of warning. And then I thought about something else entirely, something that surprised me by how clearly it arrived. I thought about Marisette at 9 years old, teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway of our childhood home because I was too afraid to try it alone, running alongside me for an entire summer afternoon until I finally stopped needing her hand on the seat. I thought about her showing up, unannounced, at my apartment during my worst week in graduate school, with soup and a movie and absolutely no explanation needed, because that was simply what she did back then, before either of us had any reason to doubt each other. I thought about 32 years of a closeness that had been real, whatever it had become in the 2 years since. I did not decide, in that moment, to forgive her. I want to be clear about that. What I decided was something narrower and, I think, more honest. I decided that my professional integrity, and my actual, factual knowledge of her professional competence were not things I was willing to weaponize, even against someone who had genuinely wronged me. I had spent 32 years watching Marisette be talented at the things she was talented at, long before Foster Callahan ever existed in either of our lives. And pretending otherwise in an official company document felt like it would cost me something I wasn't willing to lose, which was the difference between who I actually was and who her betrayal might have tempted me to become. I wrote back to Casimir Oduya a factual, professional reference, confirming what I genuinely knew to be true, that Marisette Whitfield Callahan had, in my prior professional observation, strong client relationship skills, reliable follow-through, and no history of ethical concerns in any context I was aware of. I did not mention our personal relationship in the reference itself, since that had already been fully disclosed and documented separately. I sent it, and her reauthorization proceeded normally, exactly as it should have for any employee whose work was genuinely solid. Here is where the story could have simply ended, quietly, with me having done the right thing and Marisette never even knowing it happened. But that is not, in fact, how it ended, because 2 weeks after I submitted that reference, I received a phone call from Perpetua Nakashima asking me to come to her office. Marisette had found out. Not from me, and not from Casimir, whose office operated under strict confidentiality. She had found out because a colleague in HR, someone who knew both of us socially outside of work through a mutual friend from college, had mentioned it in passing, assuming Marisette already knew, since it seemed like the kind of thing sisters would obviously discuss. Marisette had gone straight to Perpetua's office that morning, apparently in some distress, asking whether it was true that her own sister sat on the executive committee and had been quietly involved in her employment file the entire time without ever telling her. I walked into Perpetua's office that afternoon not knowing what to expect, and found Marisette already sitting there, in the chair across from Perpetua's desk, looking smaller and more uncertain than I had seen her look in years. Perpetua, to her enormous credit, handled the moment with total professionalism. She explained, calmly and factually, exactly what had happened. My disclosure at the time of Marisette's original hiring. My immediate recusal. The compliance flag that had fallen through the cracks. The reauthorization request, 11 months later, and my factual, positive reference. She made clear, in front of both of us, that I had done absolutely everything correctly, according to policy, at every single step, and that Marisette's employment had never once been at risk because of anything improper on my part. Marisette was quiet for a long moment after Perpetua finished. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, in a way she hadn't in almost a year and a half. You knew, she said. This whole time. You knew I worked here, and you never said anything. I disclosed everything to the company the moment I found out, I said. That's what I was required to do, and that's what I did. What I wasn't required to do was call you personally to give you a warning, Marisette. You didn't extend me that kind of warning when you were sitting on my couch with my fiancé. The room went very quiet. Perpetua, wisely, said nothing, simply watching, letting the moment happen the way it needed to. I could have said something negative about you, I continued, because I found, once I started, that I needed to finish the thought completely. I could have let your reauthorization stall out and disappear into compliance limbo during a restructuring where people are actively losing positions right now. Nobody would have ever known why, or been able to prove it was personal. But I didn't do that because whatever you did to me, I'm not willing to lie about your work, and I'm not willing to use my position to hurt you just because I could. That's the difference between us, Marisette. That's always been the difference between us, actually, even before any of this happened. Marisette's eyes filled, and for once, I didn't feel the old instinct to comfort her, to smooth things over the way I had for 32 years, always the reliable one making sure everyone else's feelings landed softly. I'm sorry, she said, and her voice broke on it in a way that sounded, for the first time in a long time, completely unrehearsed. I've thought about calling you so many times this past year. I never knew how after everything. And now I find out you've been protecting my job this whole time, without a single word, and I don't even know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, I said. I didn't do it for a thank you. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I apparently, know the difference between hurting you and simply refusing to lie for you. That's not the same as forgiveness, Marisette. I want to be honest about that. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and Perpetua quietly excused herself from the room to give us privacy, a small, unexpected kindness from a woman who had no obligation to give us anything beyond the facts. Marisette and I sat there for a long time after that, in a conference room on the 16th floor, saying very little at first, and then, slowly, saying more. She told me things I hadn't known, that her marriage to Foster had been harder than either of them let anyone see, strained almost from the start by the way it had begun, by the guilt neither of them had ever fully worked through. She told me she thought about our estrangement every single day, that losing me had cost her something she hadn't fully understood she would lose, that having a twin sister who simply stopped existing in her life had left a specific, permanent kind of silence that nothing else had filled. I did not tell her everything was fine. It was not fine, and I did not pretend otherwise. What I told her was that I was willing, for the first time in almost 2 years, to try having an actual conversation with her, not as twins who owed each other automatic closeness simply because of shared birth, but as two adults deciding, deliberately, whether there was anything left worth rebuilding. That was 8 months ago. I want to be honest about where things stand now, because I don't think a story like this earns a neat, complete ending, and I don't think it should pretend to. Marisette and I have dinner together roughly once a month now, careful, sometimes awkward dinners where we are both still learning how to talk to each other without the old easy shorthand we used to have, back before either of us had reason to doubt it. She still works at Holloway Meridian, on the 14th floor, doing genuinely good work I know is good because I have watched, at a professional distance, exactly how solid her client relationships have become. We do not discuss Foster much. That wound is still healing, slower than either of us would like, and I don't know yet whether it will ever fully close. Some things I've come to believe simply become part of the shape of you instead of disappearing entirely. What I do know is this. I never told my sister whose company she was applying to, because I didn't know myself until her resume was already sitting on my desk. But I also never used that accident of circumstance to hurt her, even though I could have, even though a part of me, in the rawest early weeks, might have wanted to. I chose, instead, to be exactly as honest and exactly as fair as my job required, and nothing less and nothing more. I think about that decision often, more than I think about the betrayal itself, if I'm honest. Because the betrayal was Marisette's story, the thing she did, the choice she made. But the reference, the recusal, the quiet refusal to weaponize my position against her even when I had every reason and every opportunity to do so, that was my story. That was the choice I made, in a conference room, with an email draft open in front of me, entirely alone, with no one watching, no one to perform integrity for. If someone who hurt you that deeply ended up needing something only you could give them, something you could withhold without consequence and without anyone ever knowing why, what would you have done? Would you have let them fall, quietly, the way it would have been so easy to let happen? Or would you have done what I did, and given them exactly what they were honestly owed, nothing more and nothing less, and let that be its own kind of answer?